All right, here we are. This is our fourth time gathering for the Maximos Seminar. Today, because we had to skip last time, we will still be on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, but we'll be looking at four. We're going to gather what we intended to speak about last time and the two pieces we intend to speak about tonight. So the pieces are on Christ's conquest of the Holy Passions at Thalassium 21, and on Jesus Christ and the End of Ages at Thalassium 22, and on Jesus Christ, the new Adam who became sin at Thalassium 42, and on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, which is ad Thalassium 60. Now, to provide a little bit of continuity for us, I want to harken back to two remarks that David Goa made towards the end, in the middle and towards the end of our last time together, because I think these two remarks, these two insights, these two almost aphorisms, really are important for us to continue. So I just want to reiterate them and then hand it over to David Goa and ask him to elaborate a bit, and we will see where we go from there. All right. So the first one. Oh, and two general themes that I want us to hold in mind tonight. They're the same, not the same. They're familiar. Emphasis, and presence. Emphasis and presence. Those are the two general themes. I think they'll come out well. Or another way of putting that is mediate, what is mediate and what is immediate. So emphasis and presence, or mediate and immediate. Those are the two kind of overall themes. Now, the first statement, David, that I want to draw in from what Goa said last time has to do with emphasis, I think. And I'm paraphrasing very closely, maybe not exactly, but almost exactly. The line is, when virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence. When virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence, right? When virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence. So we're speaking about something good, virtues, about how that sits within us. And then not our presence, but our capacity for presence, right? Our capacity for presence. When virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence. Now, immediately on a lesser register, one thinks of the philosophical notion of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where within a complex or a problem or an issue, you see the weight of it, the center of it being somewhere, when really you've misapprehended. The center, the weight is somewhere else, all right? That's one thing that comes to mind. Another thing that comes to mind is, and I've used this phrase more than once because it intrigues me, but the philosopher Heidegger has a phrase, the topology of being. That's where he ended his inquiry. That's where he stayed in the last 10, 15, 20 years of his life, trying to think a topology of being. So not the question of being, not the meaning of being, not the being of being, the topology of being, i.e. the landscape of being, the landscape of being, right? Topology, topos, place, the place of being. When virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence. We remember that last session, we mused around the Greek term thesis, and we said, well, a thesis is to place something, kind of to place something somewhere. So thinking is a kind of placing of something somewhere, to see how things belong. I think this touches David's line, David's comment, his insight. When virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence. So that's the first thing that I would like to ask David to unpack. And I'll say the second thing, it's equally short, and then open it up to you, David. The second insight has to do with presence. So When virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence. That's emphasis. It's not a question of validity or reality. It's emphasis. They're just weighing too much. Now, the second, presence. When one is present to another, i.e., when one is present, there is no dissonance, no dissonance. And in this sense, there is no sin. That's the second line. When one is present, there is no dissonance. And in this sense, there is no sin. When one is present, there is no dissonance. And in this sense, there is no sin. I want to hold that just alongside another thing that Goa you said last time, which was, we are told, and note his construction, we are told that when one experiences theosis, one no longer prays as one has become prayer, right? That's also David Goa I'm quoting, or closely paraphrasing. We are told that when one experiences theosis, one no longer prays because one has become prayer, i.e., one has become one's own fullness in and of relation. One has become one's own fullness in, and that's my gloss on David's insight. And so my question there, David Goa, is wherein does our fullness lie? Wherein does our fullness lie? If when we're present, there's no dissonance and there is no sin. And I think that's true. I'm not sure how, but I think it's, I know that that is true somehow. Okay. Where does our fullness lie there? And we are told that when one experiences theosis, one no longer prays, one has become prayer. Wherein does our fullness lie there? So that's how I'd like to open. And David, I'd like to just hand it to you. If you care to elaborate either of these, when virtues weigh too much, they destroy our capacity for presence, i.e. when we misemphasize in our spiritual life, what does that do, right? And when one is present, there is no dissonance, and in this sense, there is no sin. So virtues, i.e., can lead directly to dissonance and sin, or they cannot. Pardon me, David, please, wherever you'd like to take this.
It's always dangerous for me to speak about virtues since I don't know them. But I wondered about it. I mean, people that are virtuous, that I admire, that sense of excellence, arete, you know, where the very best of a person is present, and where there's some sense of that, and so it's cultivated and maybe even protected. When I think of the virtues, I'm reminded of how prudence is in a sense the meta virtue. It's the virtue of the virtues. And why is that? Well, because prudence is really the stance of discernment. And the discernment is not a discernment of one's own excellence. Rather, it's a discernment of what is unfolding in front of one. It's a discernment of what is going on in the life of another. So I think what I was trying to hint at there was how even a preoccupation with excellence
Yeah.
can banish discernment, and can then place the other, whatever one is faced with, in a dark place, in a place of judgment or of non-consideration or even of humiliation. So when virtue weighs too heavy, it destroys our capacity for presence. My sense is that in the tradition we're engaged in considering here, the virtues are important. There is this sense of human excellence, which is calling for growth and development and maybe even perfection. But that it is, unlike our great philosophical ancestors, Plato and Aristotle, you people all know more about them than I do. It isn't actually the center. It's there. It's part of the understanding of the gift of human nature and the gift of all creation, that everything that is has its own virtue, its own excellence, its own integrity, its own gift. But the Christian take on that, I think, or part of what I see in Maximus is trying to help us understand, is that the call of the other, whether that is God, the holy other, or whether it's the person we meet in the street, that ought to incline us to discernment and to careful attentiveness, to what we may be able to glimpse as or what may call forth from us an illuminating word. So your comment about topology of the kind of landscape that topos and where Heidegger is at, and I mean, that is not, to whatever extent I understand it, that is not saying that being is something. It is pointing to an occasion, pointing to a very dynamic moment of attentiveness. And building on what I said, of discernment. Does that make any sense? You want to probe it? Speak about it?
David, is one of the issues about the weight or the burden of virtue, in part because it is this action-based versus passive that we were reading about in the readings tonight, that it's to use some language like Paul or some, that this is a Luther, that, you know, it's a works righteousness type of thing, that it is we feel ourselves are the author or the subject in the attempt to pursue virtue, and by so doing, we don't take that passive stance where we are open to the other. Is that the one of the veins to go back on it, or is there somewhere else to go on the virtue? I'm absolutely loving this, and what I've heard, I love. I'm just trying to place it within the bigger context.
Yeah, I think that what you've suggested there, David, is another way of looking at this. It's such a cautionary note about our presumptions of what is good.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, that's so. Yeah, I don't know that I want to say much more about it. I mean, in some ways, it's also well, let me just say one other thing. You know, in the Eastern Christian tradition, we have this class of saints. We have lots of classes of saints. We like our classes of saints. So one of the classes of saints is holy fools. And so when you read about holy fools, or if you've ever met one, I think I've known a couple people in my life that I thought were maybe holy fools. What they do within the tradition, and when we read the stories about them in the Desert Fathers or even in Dostoevsky or various places, what we see them do is remind us that the point of the way to virtue is not itself. We are creatures of relationship. We are made for the world. So the point of our life isn't ourself. It's the world. It's the life of the world. It's communion. It's to be in the world. Not of it, because of it is the great presumptions about what it ought to be. We're to be in it, present to it. But I think what you've said, David, is another way of looking at at least a part of this. Other?
David, I had a question. I was just wondering around that in terms of how the patristic scholars think about, which we talked about last time, like self-love. And so is it sort of that this weightiness of virtue, or this overextension of virtue, is David Jennings just sort of said, is there something about that self-love that it almost, rather than opening us to to experience it closes us to it. Like there's a kind of, like I'm thinking about sort of people who have become almost fearful of like becoming tainted somehow, or that somehow their virtue will be afflicted or affected or robbed from them in some ways. And so I don't know, there's something about the self in that conversation that I'm wrestling with and clearly don't have it all together. So I'll just put myself back on mute.
Yeah, self-love is a curious term in our culture because of what our culture does with all that sort of thing. So I suppose one of the preoccupations in this literature is that well, I go back to a creed in another tradition. It's a lovely thing about Christianity. We have 1,000 creeds. And that creed in this other tradition speaks about the only love there really is to love God and enjoy God forever. So that is to anchor one's stance, not in any images one has of oneself, because the images we have of oneself are a form of idolatry, just as images we have of God are a form of idolatry. These are deeply interconnected with each other. So I think if I've understood you, Lorraine, those forms of self-love are disordered. They are to put yourself at the center for whatever reasons, and that needs to be healed so that what is given to you, what is revealed, what addresses you, what you encounter, you are capable of being present to.
I like what you said very much. I like what you said very much, David. And I appreciate what David and Lorraine have said. Prudence as a meta virtue. I like that. That's a bit cute, but I like that. I like it because it's the governing, and I think that immediately puts a lot else into perspective. And then just following your line of thinking, as I noted it, if virtue then is excellent, it's not a badge, it's not a merit thing. It's not even something that can be taken for granted. One is not hospitable. One is always striving to be as hospitable as possible. And insofar as one excels at that, then that becomes a virtue, and so on. And how you, I like this almost as much as the first, how an excellence can banish discernment. Yeah, because if we shine too brightly ourselves, or think we do, we don't see the light of others coming in. And then you said, without the present, my maybe paraphrase, without the presence of others, how will our own illuminating word be drawn forth? i.e., our light isn't self-generated. Our virtue is not self-generated. Any light that may possibly ever shine through us is because of the relation to and the communion with another, who then, through their intercession into our word, shows how that may shine, I think. I like that very much. It seems a strong way through. And then even your comment on Heidegger's phrase and how it's not a kind of description of being or definition of being. No, it's about how, as you said, a dynamic moment of attentiveness, that attentiveness to then to how then to go forth in the question, in the field, in the cosmos, right, of being or of meaning or of virtue. So when we're disciplining, I thought I was going to ask you if we should come up with a topology of presence, topology of being. When is being emphasized? Topology of presence. But that would be borrowing a phrase that I don't think is quite appropriate to what we're talking about here. But I like that attentiveness, and that's part of prudence too. And that attentiveness that you're talking about, I think, the attentiveness to the landscape in front of us, the attentiveness that allows us to know when our excellence is to be put to good use or when it is to be quiet for a while. That attentiveness is extraordinarily close to prayer in our tradition's way of thinking, as you know. The Greek words are basically the same. And it's also, I mean, even in the words, it is prayer. It is prayer.
Hearing, because it's hearing, or at least it's
exactly.
It's listening.
And it's also very close to our sense of watchfulness, of vigil, of just being for a while and listening. Yeah, exactly what you're saying, hearing, listening. Yeah, I like that very much. So then, David, if one is hearing, if one is present, what about, is it time to shift our focus to the second remark that you, if you wouldn't mind, just to remind everyone, the line is, when one is present, there is no dissonance. And in this sense, there is no sin. And then David also talked about praying and becoming prayer, as it were. But pardon me, David, go, please. What have you been thinking about these ideas you had last time?
I suppose I've been thinking of how much I lack presence. So yeah, I'm not sure about it. I mean, I was trying to point towards the notion of that presence is not obviously not something. It is not. It's not an emotion. When I suggest when one is present, there is no dissonance. I mean, that's assuming that the presence is in some ways full, which I think it's pretty rare. It doesn't mean just with people, it means with in our walk in the world, to be present to a great piece of music. I remember years ago, Claudio Arrau, an old man at the time, a great musician, was here in Edmonton. He came to Edmonton because he was an old man and past his prime. So this is why Edmonton exists. Instead of just Vancouver.
I thought it was because of the rain and the traffic jams in Vancouver.
Yeah. So Claudio Arrau was here for a concert at the Jubilee Auditorium. And I didn't go. I was at home with our children. But Della, she went, and she's a cultivated musician herself. And I remember several hours later, I had actually fallen asleep reading a story to the kids. She comes in from this concert, and she's weeping, like really weeping. And after a time comes to more ease. And then she says that Aral played, but it's the first time she'd ever been in the presence in a concert where the music played the musician. And as a result, there was no applause. Everybody left weeping. So, I mean, for me, it's a kind of amazing example of how presence fills everything. No, I think I don't know if I've said this before or not, but I sometimes think that the word sin in our spiritual tradition is a kind of euphemism for experience. That is, all experience rooted in choice. You know, we choose something. When we choose something, we choose not something else. And so I wonder if, I mean, that's why I love that lovely New Testament phrase that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, you know, and why I often call it the Magna Carta of the Christian tradition. The problem isn't sin. The problem is realizing when you have missed the mark, or when the fullness hasn't been there, when you've misunderstood, when you've misspoke, misstepped, and lessening the distance between that and your consciousness of it, and to what extent you can, your repair of it. So so in that Arousal concert, there was no dissonance there. It had a kind of pure presence. And there are times that we experience that, I think. There are also times we think we experience it, and it's a huge mistake. That's the other part of this. Misunderstanding that. Assuming that's what it is, when in fact it's a much deeper kind of passion that's at work in one. So, but when it's there, I say there's no sin. I mean, to me, that's what the presence of the kingdom of God is. That's what our tradition speaks about. That's the presence of the kingdom of God. And of course, at the center of our liturgical worship, the coming to communion, the whole Eucharistic act is, and all of our theologies, you know, I think it's kind of charming the way Christian theologies kind of dance different steps around this. But all of them are making a very similar point, which is this is about presence. This is about the invitation to come into the presence, to be. Attentive, open, together in the breaking of the bread. So so in that sense, in those gifts, when we experience or in the presence of the kingdom, there is no sin. And in that, as you pointed out, I think, Andrew, you know, those unfoldings in our life are what our prayer gestures towards. And so some of the early church fathers who make the comment that when you experience theosis, when you are one with the divine, when you are in the kingdom, you do not pray because you are prayer. A number of them also go on to say, but I've never met anybody who was there. And of course, they've never met anybody who was there, because to be there means you're there and not reflecting on being there. You are just there. It's an unfolding grace.
Go ahead, David.
Just to say, this is a very minor point to one of the really, David, that's in our present age, we practice reflection so often. At its most mundane, the selfie that people take wherever they are, pictures taken everywhere to try to record this. It is really hard to find that moment as an observer where you are completely present. I think that perhaps I may be wrong, but I think probably the closest I've ever got to it is witnessing those who are present, like a jazz musician.
Sure.
And when they're, there's a trio up on the stage and they're just completely engaged with one another.
Yeah.
I get to participate with that.
Yeah.
But I'm not that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really, I think art is certainly one of the places where we see this, or even, and you have a very cultivated eye, David, going and looking at great works of art. Great works of art are, I think, the difference between first-rate art and second-rate art is presence.
Yeah, that's it.
And when you stand in the face of it, whether it's the jazz musician or whether it's one of those great Dutch painters or Rubloff.
Yeah.
You're brought into it.
I when I was a young man, well, not even a man yet, but I was a ski bum in Banff, Alberta, and we had this joke back then because of the group. This is back in the early '80s, and the joke was you would talk to a Japanese tourist and say, "So are you enjoying your time?" And they would answer, "I don't know. I haven't got my pictures back yet." Now we do have digital pictures, so there's this immediacy, but there is still that element of people trying to record and capture rather than participate.
Mm.
And you know, you just see it. I was in New York City last week, and you know, it was so beautiful to be able to get back into a great art gallery and a museum that I haven't been for so long. And I've been in Boston. The Titians, I don't know if you know, but they're the famous Titians that were making their rounds. But in the Met, and what was wonderful was, compared to what normally happens at the Met, where there's streams of people walking by, all taking pictures as they're running through, with the COVID-timed admission and that sort of stuff. There's so few people that you could actually just take the time in front of a painting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The lack of sin is I mean, there's so many things, but I think that in my Protestant tradition, sin is so heavily weighed upon, but I don't think, or I think you would say, and I welcome your contradiction to it, but I think you would say that the lack of sin is not what defines us versus God. Because I think for Protestants, they might actually, many Protestants would say it's the thing that separates us from God and is the distinguishing feature of us versus God is sin. But what you've talked about there, real presence,
Yeah.
and you know, fair enough, as rare as it is, there's no claim of being God or of essence of God through that.
Yeah. Yeah. Another image, it's drawn on the scripture, of course, drawn on the narrative of Jesus Christ's parable of the virgins who come to the bedchamber, those that have oil in their lamp and those that don't. A number of the reflections on this say that the only thing that the oil that you have in your lamp will be your tears.
Yeah.
The only thing you have is your compassion, which I think, to my mind, compassion is to enter into the passion of others, is to be present to them.
Yeah.
Is to recognize they're real and something's going on.
Which, to get back to our first reading tonight, where it makes the point that Christ took on the principalities and powers twice, one to deal with pleasures, and then the second one to deal with pain.
Yeah.
And by breaking down those two, then you can be present.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Great.
That's wonderful, David.
Yeah, why don't you speak more about that?
I haven't got anything more than that. Just I'm still staggered by most of what I've read.
I do want to get back to the text soon, though.
Yeah.
But first, David Goa, I wanted to come back to something that you said about sin being potentially, or possibly, a euphemism for experience. That's in a way framed lightheartedly, deliberately so. But in another way, there is something very profound in there. In that, if sin means erring or missing the mark, i.e., if sin means not, let's say, achieving the fullness of each moment as it happens, then of course it's difficult. Of course it's common. But if sin means not fulfilling or not achieving the fullness of each moment as it happens, then presence is over against that, because presence is the striving to be attentive to the fullness of the moment as it happens, right? And so sin, I mean, David Jennings, you've referenced the on the, what's it called, on Jesus Christ, to the new Adam who became sin, right? And in that text, immediately there are two notions of sin. One is chosen separation, and the other as the, let's say, the state of estrangement from God. He calls it corruption, mortality, in other words, in this. It strikes me that in a way, David Goy, your comment, when one is present, and just skip to the second part, there is no sin. Again, we're not speaking ideally as in it's a dream. We're speaking really, even if it's unknown to anyone or all or none or of us, right? It's unknown to me. It's unknown to many. But when one is present, there is no sin. That is real. That's real. What does that mean? Well, when one is present and holds the wholeness, the fullness of the other, then there is indeed no separation. That's true, somehow, right? But also it means when one is present and in communion with the other, then one has turned aside from the concerns of mortality as well. Turned aside from the concerns of self-limitation as well. So I think that your statement, David, really it is rich enough to embrace both of these notions of sin, and then there are other. I mean, you yourself, we have brought, all of us have brought up, different ways of thinking about sin as missing the mark, or as waywardness, or as turning aside, or as errancy. But we know it's not a damned mistake. That's not what sin is. We know it's not thinking wrongly and then that's it. Being wrong in your mind about, I said God was big and he's small. Oh, that's a sin, or something like that. It's not on that level. It's a much profounder spiritual level. And soon I want to get into the text for tonight, because in these two texts tonight, we have very, very interesting passages about discernment, what David talked about earlier. And I really like how you brought discernment into both of your kind of major comments, David Goa. Discernment regarding the virtues, right? You said prudence, which is, I like the word discernment as much as I like the word prudence, but discernment is the key, or the arc virtue, the arche virtue, the establishing the relations of virtue. And then also discernment and presence, because presence depends upon discernment. But David Go, I'm wondering if you have thoughts or comments or questions, ways in that you would like to take us into these two pieces, maybe for tonight, on Jesus Christ, the new Adam who became sin. We've talked about that a bit. Perhaps we focus on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ for a little while. I want to go back to on Jesus Christ who became sin momentarily for something later. But David, go. What do you make of this short piece on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ? And not just David, Lorraine, Michael, David Jennings. I don't mean to narrow it down, but I want to begin with you, David. It's an immense piece. The editors enjoyed it so much they titled the volume this. Maybe it sounds dramatic. I don't know. On the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ.
Was this the one you were referring to, David?
No, he was referring
No.
to on Jesus Christ, the new Adam who became sin.
Uh,
Or David, would you like me to give my few thoughts on the idea of scope and
Yeah.
scopos?
yeah, please do, because that's here, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just one page back. That's why I'm so. Let's turn our attention to page 122 for 1 second, just about 8 lines up from the bottom. I want to think about a short passage here, and it's mainly to do with, let's say, attending to terminology and ways of thinking that imply or that are involved in interpretation, in our understanding, maybe. Let's put it that way. So about 8 lines up. Maximus used the word scopos, intended purpose, scopos. So according to the intended purpose, the scopos, scope, of the text, as we have rendered it here, and respecting the proper conceptual distinction between the 2 meanings of sin, we just went over that, etc. He makes his point. I want to go back to this idea of scopos, or intended purpose, because it touches something that has intrigued me for a while now. And that is trying to find a term, a word, a concept, which both, let's say, describes and defines, maybe that's the way of putting it. That both, well, let's just work through it. That takes the measure of and measures. Yeah. So scopos here, scopos translates intended purpose. And in the footnote, we have a further intention, a further definition of ultimate intention, or scopos. The editors say that it's an Alexandrian hermeneutical principle. So the Athanasius and Kirill of Alexandria, who were leading early, very, very important scholars. Scopos, or purpose. Scope means, or scopos means purpose, intention, or scope, right? Purpose, intention, scope. In other words, this word scopos means to discern both the extension of something and the quality of that thing, the extension of it and the quality. Or one might say that the topos of a thing, the landscape of a thing, and the ethos, the character of a thing. It's that dual activity that intrigues me. Scopos. And I wonder then, is it akin to the word compass? Compass, because compass means both to compass, in circle, and to give direction within, right? So it means to gather and give measure, or to gather and give measure, maybe. And then I think, okay, scope, compass, and then horizon, another word which really intrigues me. Horizon. I named my journal after this, Modern Horizons. Horizon. The Greek word for horizon is in part a verb. It's how it's the parallel of our word define. To horizon, to define it, to horizon something is to give its definition, as we would say. But the Greek word is to enhorizon it. In other words, a horizon is that which is encompassed. Horizon is that which is encompassed. So scope, compass, horizon, maybe. We remember, just as a side note, that thesis means placement within a horizon, to discern belonging. There's David's discerning and belonging, the belonging of the virtues together. But horizon, so scope, purpose, intention, extension, quality, maybe akin to compass, that which is gathered and given measure. Horizon, that which is encompassed. And then I found out that aphorism comes from two Greek words, apo horizon, drawn from the horizon. Aphorism means drawn from, i.e., drawn from that which has been horizoned, which, as we know, along this line of thought, which means that which has been compassed, that which has been encircled and gathered, so to speak, and given measure to. Aphorism. So then an aphorism is something like the gathered concentration, of that which has scope and compass within a horizon, right? Aphorism, the gathered concentration of that which has scope and compass within the horizon. And I'm not sure how this connects or if it connects, but in my mind then, that the insight into apo horizon as aphorism might give us some insight into the apophasis. Apophasis is, if apo horizon is that which is drawn from the gathered concentration of that which is scope and compass within a horizon, maybe the apophatic is that which the gathered concentration of that which has scope and compass within the sayable, moving beyond it. That's a side note. In any case, Maximus's unpacking of this word, scopos, is about a text here. He's saying the scope of the text, according to the scope of the text, etc. This is his way of measuring. So he's not just reading to extract a phrase, or he's not just reading to be right, to be proved right, or he's not just reading to shore up his own intuition. All that's important, but it's not what he's doing. He's saying, this is our approach. And it reminds me of David's emphasis, apophasis, emphasis. David's emphasis earlier on discernment. Discernment. And Maximus is saying, this is part of our discernment of what is important about the Holy Scriptures. Or, as we see in the next one, we'll move on to this now, the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, in a person. We have to think in terms of the engatheredness, the concentrated quality of, and then what can be drawn from that, the scope and compass within the horizon of the other, or within the horizon of the text, and so on. This is quite a different way of reading than we might be used to, or it might be the way of reading that we're all used to. I don't want to assume. But it struck me as very, very interesting, so I pondered it. But David Goa, building on that, and Michael Burke, you haven't stepped in much tonight, so maybe I'll put you on the spot. But drawing from this kind of idea, on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ, I want to question you two, but also Lorraine, also David Jennings, about the first page. It's titled On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ. And then the first thing we read is the scriptural text. Okay, we've just been talking about scope, compass, aphorism, comprehension. The scriptural text calls the mystery of Christ, Christ. Right? The mystery of Christ, which means the scriptural text calls Christ the mystery of Christ. They're coterminous in terms of our own terminology. It's both a person and a depth, an unfathomable depth. David Goa, what do you make of this first page? How they draw together the idea of hypostatic union. Hypostasis is a new word for us. We've heard ecstasis. We've been talking about stasis. But what do you make of this first page? And Michael, I have you in mind too.
Well, I love the first line. So the mystery of Christ is anointing. The mystery of Christ is oil. The mystery of Christ is mercy. So the mystery of Christ is the anointed encounter. The encounter where the wounds of the world are anointed with the oil of gladness. So Andrew raises this and then disappears. So, did you have thoughts on it, Michael?
Maybe he's simply turned into this cat.
Yeah, you could have. Yeah.
Oh no, okay, that was an hypothesis.
Oh.
He could have turned back.
Right. So go on with this. We're not just talking about, say, an identity.
Yeah.
Andrew, I think you're something fuzzy on your mic side.
No, it's just a little lower, the volume on your mic.
Andrew?
If I speak now, am I comprehensible?
It
Not
seems a
really well.
little lower, I think.
It's fuzzy.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to.
Oh, you just broke up, Lorraine.
If I
Give it
speak
the
now,
word.
am I back to volume or am I not?
It's not as clear as you were before.
Yeah, that's just what I was trying to say. It wasn't as clear as it was before. Sorry, I'm having IT hell. So
Sorry, my family isn't here, so maybe, is this sound okay?
Much better. Yeah.
Okay. Hold on, turn you guys up. No, all I was saying was, pardon me, it was a bad time to go to the washroom. But David, I'm interested in this, what you draw out immediately from the first line. Go on with this idea of the mystery of Christ. The mystery of Christ then is the anointed one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this this sort of central notion within the Christian tradition that the wounds of the world are there. They're there, and they're real, and they're not going to disappear. But they can be anointed.
Yeah.
They can be anointed with the oil of gladness.
Yeah.
And that anointing makes resurrection possible. That anointing means you can become supple again. It means you are not colonized by your wounds. It means that sin does not have dominion over you. Not only that, it also means that where the wounds are, when they're anointed, they become a form of revelation. Because you have learned something from whatever caused the wounds, and that will deepen, ought to deepen. If it simply paralyzes you with fear, it won't, but it ought to deepen your knowledge of the human condition and deepen your compassion for other human beings. You understand,
And this goes,
your struggle and other human beings' struggle are not dissimilar. And you may now, if they're anointed, if they become Christos, there is some knowledge, there is an illumination there that you can also give to others.
and David, this circles back to earlier when you were talking about the stance of presence, meaning there is no sin, depending upon or relying upon the other person, the presence of the other person. It's not a disposition of our own.
Yeah.
And I wanted to probe a potential avenue. The mystery of Christ, who is Christ, and Christ means the anointed one. You've just beautifully laid out that image, the anointed one. Then I wonder, you know, we have this phrase which circles around in our tradition, perhaps others too, I don't know. But be, to put it crudely, welcome the stranger, because they may be the only Christ you'll ever know.
Yeah.
They may be the only anointed one you ever know, i.e. each person is potentially anointed, and in a way they already are. In a way they already are. As the image of God.
And they may not know it, and you may not know it.
And it doesn't matter though. Yeah.
The call is at least for you to know it. Because that'll.
And even if you not to know that they're, even if you don't know they're Christ, you still act in that comprehension.
Yeah.
Act in that, with that awareness, because how would you ever know? But
David, in any instance other than Jesus, the anointing seems to be to heal what is broken within that person itself.
Right.
But in Jesus, the anointing, as you've described it, goes to the healing of the cosmos. Because he took on the brokenness of the cosmos, that with his anointing, he heals the cosmos. And for most of us, you know, whether it's the elders are to gather around with oil to heal or whatever, it's for the person upon whom the oil is placed. But again, this whole sacrificial nature of Jesus. Just another, you know, magnificent way of saying this, that you know, he took on the sins of the world. But it's not just he took on the sins of the world, he took on the healing for the world. I hadn't really put that so explicitly before. That's
nice.
aren't they the same then, David Jennings? Just following that nice line of thinking. I mean, it's one and the same. By encompassing, taking them on, by embracing, by integrating our own lack, he has therefore, I'm not even sure of the words here, but it happens that now it is full. That we have a fullness.
But only in Christ. That's right. In anything else where we look to heal our own wounds, whether it's in possessions or fame or, you know, efforts on our own part, it doesn't do it. But in Christ, we have the anointed one, the only true anointing. Yeah. Michael,
what do you make of this last? I want to get into the text heavily soon, but what do you make of this last? Oh, and Lorraine too. I'm sorry, I can't see you, so in the back of my mind, I think you're not there, but of course you're there. Lorraine, with this last text as well on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. Michael first, and then maybe Lorraine, if you want to, if you care to respond. What do you make of this? What stands out for you?
I don't. Lorraine, did you want to go first?
No, please go ahead, because I'm on like 10-second delay. So please go ahead.
Okay, I was hoping to say something that wouldn't find any disparagement from you. So I'll sort of pause for 10 seconds and then say something atrocious. But I I hope this doesn't sound trite, but I think it's really important, and it's been quite heartening to see this conversation unfold. That's why I'm, kind of felt quite happy to sit back so holistically. And quite a striking instance of that was when David, as he's as he's done in the past, referred to this second or third sentence that we were looking at about referring to, he is of course referring to Christ, the whole mystery of Christ, which is manifestly the ineffable. I don't know what word that's translating in Greek, because I know in the past Andrew's commented on that and had some apprehension about the use of the word ineffable.
Yeah, I don't know.
So maybe you might, do you happen to know, or just?
I don't know. I wish I did.
But we'll just go say the ineffable and incomprehensible hypostatic union between Christ's divinity and humanity. And David was remarking how we're all drawn up in this when we face another, and this goes right back to the question of discernment. Or I'm steeped in Hegel these days in his logic and phenomenology, so a lot of this is quite. I think he's providing a kind of remedy of a kind of systematically sinful way of looking at persons, fundamentally sinful way that causes them literally to disappear. And I'll sort of draw this in to this. Before I became a Christian, I think I was already for a decade there, just mesmerized by the Christian innovation of the idea of the logos, that it becomes flesh. I think this, it provides the most profound answer to the subject-object problem, which didn't really even sort of flower into the modern philosophy. So Christ, or the Gospel of John, anticipates this by 1,500 years. And it's so, recognition has the possibility of sin built into it when it becomes, I'll just jump forward just a little, just to the end of page, if I remember correctly, in the same essay on the cosmic mystery of Christ, the very last sentence of page, beginning at the bottom of page 126, by perception, I mean participation in the known object, which manifests itself beyond all conceptualization. So that relates to the previous passage, which I just read. It sort of picks out the same potential in perception of simply seeing manifestation and taking that manifestation for exhaustive of all there is. That is, in a sense, what modern philosophy, what cognitive scientists, philosophers who want to sort of be with it, can't begin to acknowledge the notion of something that is there but isn't manifest. So I'm going to throw a little wrinkle in just by saying this. It's kind of my bad modern philosopher's conscience working, and then I'll sort of undo it in a way in my reading of Hegel, he does, by saying the following. I'm sort of riffing on the something that Hegel said that's always perplexed me, and maybe he still will, but that all we can, all there is the manifestation of, when we're looking at another self, all we can see are manifestations of linguistic behavior, gestures, acts, behavior of the person. And yet, if we were to take that notion and look at it one-sidedly, we would just see that, and then that would be scrutinized, analyzed to death, and I'll say from a physicalistic or positivistic standpoint, and it would dissolve. There wouldn't be any self. If the self is simply the manifestations of its verbal and other behavior, and that's all we see. So the disturbing thing I'm going to say, then I'll qualified in a way that maybe makes its significance change dramatically. The disturbing thing is this, that I think that's right. That is all we can see, literally see. But recognition, or what David was describing as discernment, takes us beyond that, because while it's true, we can only see what is manifest to us physically through sight and sound, and etc. And on that basis, the self disappears. But if we see the self not as a particular thing, this goes back to a conversation a few weeks ago, but as becoming, then none of the manifestations of the self capture the self. So this would be a kind of, I suppose, apophatic way of looking at the self, just as, and that to me is, and recognition goes in both directions. So this, we recognize another, and when we recognize the other, we can only see manifestations, but we should never assume, if we're actually trying to recognize the other, we should throw ourselves into the other in such a way that we imagine the other also as the self. And we also depend on that, and I won't try to explicate this, but I'll just sort of assert it, hopefully not dogmatically, that we also, it works the other way too. We also have to be open to recognition. So it's a two-sided thing. It's truly relational. And in being recognized by the other, and seeing the other as that who can recognize us, not simply as things we say, manifestations that we're demonstrating, that if they were just to be abstracted and looked at, they would be worthless, but also as something that is, I'll just, beyond all conceptualization. So it's a manifestation, but we can't reduce the manifestation to how it appears. It's part of a becoming, which even if that other self, God forbid, were to die in the course of my interactive reciprocal recognition, what I recognized was in a state of becoming, even if the person, say, literally ceased to be. And if I simply say, oh, okay, the person ceased to be, how fortunate, I can capture all of their manifestations. Let's say I had the God's eye view and I could go back from the time they were born, but that wouldn't quite capture it. I'd say, well, what do you mean? It's a totality of facts that were available. That should capture it. But it wouldn't, because the manifestations are part of something that is always in a state of becoming, not something that is ever precise, that in principle you can't even put your finger on, even though all you can do is put your finger on manifestations. Okay. And end of spiel.
Michael, can I follow up immediately with just a couple of questions? Because I think it's very, very interesting. Two things. When we talked about the person as not being but becoming, so to speak, we also thought about a kind of stance that endured through becoming, a kind of basic kind of countenance that would endure through becoming. That's the first question. The second question, though, and I hope this makes sense. I don't think this is playing. With the word manifestation, aren't we, okay, are we assuming, or are we skirting, or can we avoid a dualism then? The dualism of being and appearing? Because what I was thinking was manifestation, yeah, the standing out, the standing forth, yeah. But then one of our terms that we've been thinking about too is emphasis. And what do we thought of manifestation, rather than as a kind of an echo or a representation or a kind of derivation of something? What if it's just emphasis? Back to the topology of being where we began, with the idea that it's all there. We're just looking at its landscape. or to David's notion of when virtues weigh too heavily. They're all there, but when they weigh too heavily. So another way of putting David's thing then might be when virtues manifest themselves too strongly, right? When they're too much emphasized. I'm wondering if that's a way around the dualism which you seem to be resisting, and yet you find caught up in this question that you're pursuing. Or am I off?
I think the dualism is present in the analytic or positivistic way of looking at manifestations as exhaustive of what they are.
That's
and,
your other
and then the irony is that when you're looking at them as pure object, the subjective part, which should always be in tension, there should always be a tension between the subject and object. That tension dissolves, and all there is the object. So it's a strange view of the world. Whereas the idea of the logos becomes flesh means that the meaning of the becoming that person isn't separable from that which is incomprehensible, namely this becoming. It's not as though the becoming produces something that you can then just look at as an object.
No.
You can't separate the two. I suppose and so if we only see what we see, then we're not really involved in an active recognition.
No, and I love the way that you put the integrity of Christ bypasses that whole subject, or solves or answers that whole subject. I think that's a profound way of putting it. Yeah. There's no, I mean, essence in Greek is ousia, as we know, and presence in Greek is parousia. It's built out of the essence. I like to think it's the face of the essence, presence. And parousia is a word which we use sometimes for the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Christ. Parousia, right? And that makes me think of your integration there too. Yeah. Well, should I take us through a few more, because I want to lead up to and build on something you state that you refer to there, Michael, at the bottom of 126 over to 127. But let me walk us through a couple of questions.
And Andrew, I think you froze for a second.
Me moving up.
Oh,
Am I back?
Yeah.
Am I back now?
There you go. You're back.
It happened. Where did I leave off?
Andrew's in Moose Jaw, so when he wants to walk, he's going to be freezing. Walk through something.
You caught me, David. I'm gonna take a walk after this. I want to let's look at a couple of passages from On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ, because I think that this text is extraordinarily important. And there's a very curious moment when Maximus kind of juggles almost a handful of our very, very key terms. But follow me kind of, or follow along. I will too. Just kind of carefully, cursorily for a moment, and then we'll get into the heart of it. So at the beginning of this On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ, again, just to reiterate, Maximus refers to Christ, or rather the whole mystery of Christ. This is page 125, right? Christ, or rather the whole mystery of Christ. I'm just going to plumb some words here. The whole mystery of Christ. Mystery means
Andrew, just because you're going to go in deep, I think you said page 125, you meant 123.
It's repeated on 125.
Yeah.
On the top of the paragraph. But you're right. Okay. You're right, David. Pardon me.
Yeah. Okay.
So, on 125 in the top of the first full paragraph, and then 3 lines later, or 3 or 4 lines later, he refers to the union which Michael has just talked about very beautifully, the union. So the mystery of Christ is what Michael was just referring to in at some length, some good length. It's about integrity. And right here in the same page, we have it's the union of age and timelessness, measure and immeasurable, finite and infinite, and so on and so forth. So the question that I want to pursue is with which, now here's the problem, criteria, with which measure, with which metric, with which compass, with which scope, in which horizon do we begin to try to consider the mystery of Christ, the whole mystery of Christ? So then, if you will, please turn over to page 126, because this is the page that I want to spend some time on. 126. Now, in the first full paragraph, the first sentence, the scriptural word knows of 2 kinds of knowledge of divine, 2 kinds of knowledge, but they're both of divine things. That's important to note, but 2 kinds of knowledge, first of all. Now, I'm going to read a bit and then kind of comments, and then comment a bit more, and then read a bit more, and then comment again. So, reading, following the next sentence. On the one hand, there is relative knowledge. That's the first category. It's maybe surprising, that term, but relative knowledge. Rooted only in reason and ideas, and lacking in the kind of experiential perception of what one knows through active engagement. All right. So relative knowledge, which lacks experiential perception that comes through active engagement. And then just moving down. On the other hand, 1 line further, there is that truly authentic knowledge, okay, so relative and authentic, gained only by actual experience. Curious, and this translation sometimes just frustrates me. Apart from reason and ideas, as if those aren't experienced, which provides a total perception of the known object through a participation, methexis, by grace. And I just want to pause here for 1 moment. Relative knowledge, and actual knowledge. Now, my way of making sense of this is relative knowledge, that relative, I think by that he means knowledge that's related to other knowledge. So ideas are related to other ideas. We explain one idea or one bit of reasoning by way of another bit of reasoning. That's on the one hand. I think it's relative in the sense that it needs more knowledge. On the other hand, I think relative indicates the ancient Greek idea of a closed ontology, where reason was able to relate everything within the cosmos to everything else. There was no mystery in the way that we understand the mystery of the person of Christ, like Michael has just outlined nicely. So I think relative means within the closed ontology of the Greeks. All right, closed ontology is not my term; it's John Zizioulis' term, but it's a beautiful term. The closed ontology of the Greeks, in which ontology provided the purview of inquiry, which is why Heidegger stays with ontology, because he stays with the Greeks. He doesn't know Christ, and where reason can measure the reaches. So that's relative knowledge. It's important, and it gives us something, really something. He distinguishes this with truly authentic knowledge, which he links with participation. A total perception of the known object through a participation by grace. So authentic knowledge, which is participative, is with and beyond relative knowledge, because it depends, of course, upon reason and ideas. But through participation, which Michael Burke you've been talking about, David Go you've been talking about, David Jennings you've been talking about, Lorraine you've been talking about, participating in the event, being present in the event, right? So relative knowledge and authentic knowledge. Now, just to be careful, pardon me if this doesn't matter, but to be careful, I think that relative knowledge is via the diania, what we last time defined as diania, through the nous, the lesser, let's say, lesser register of the mind, right? The nous, which is the realm of truly authentic knowledge, is the higher register of the mind. Relative knowledge is part of the diania. The editors of the Philokalia, which we begin in a couple of sessions, called diania the mind or the reasoning, and they call the nous the intellect or the apperceptive faculty. So relative knowledge and truly authentic knowledge. Now, following on 60% through that 60% through that paragraph, they say, beginning they say, about 5 lines up from the bottom of the paragraph, they say, okay, this is how relative and authentic knowledge are integrated. And note the construction, they say. It's like David's earlier, we are told. It's a careful construction. It's saying, I have an inkling of this, but I'm not going to talk about my inkling of this. I'm going to relate the tradition's experience of this. Anyways, they say that the relative knowledge based on reason and ideas can motivate our desire for the participative knowledge acquired by active engagement, i.e., relative knowledge is not to be discarded, it's scaffolding, leading to this more authentic participative knowledge, as it were. They say, moreover, again, they say, that this active experiential knowledge, which by participation furnishes, think of that, furnishes the direct perception of the object known, furnishes, think of topology, think of landscape, think of emphasis, furnishes the direct perception of the object known, can supplant the relative knowledge based on reason and ideas. So in other words, the relative knowledge is not to be discarded. It is the way to a way to authentic knowledge, but authentic knowledge does supplant it, i.e., after one has attained authentic knowledge, I imagine, then one can, as it were, drink directly from the well-being. Now, so that's the work of the mind. Those are both elements, aspects of the work of the mind. And remember, we want to hold the work of the mind and the work of the heart in mind, right? Because the text gets stranger immediately. So I want to give a prelude. The work of the mind, and this is the work of the mind. Now Maximus draws in the work of the heart. Now I'm going to read this next sentence without his definitions. I'm just going to read the Greek because I think it's more important for us, all right? And then we'll go into the definitions. He continues, for the sages say, okay, he stepped it up, not just they say. He's appealing to the highest authority. His highest authorities are always an old man told me, or the sages say. That's Maximus' appeal. The sages say that it is impossible for logos of God, our logos, our ideas of God, to coexist with our pira experience of God, or for noesis, from noetic, noesis of God, to coexist with aesthesis of God. All right, I'll read it again. The sages say it is impossible for logos of God to coexist with experience of, or pira of God, rather, pardon me, or for noesis of God to coexist with aesthesis of God. Now, this is an upheaval, because often we think of aesthesis, the realm of the aesthetic, as being secondary, very secondary to the realm of the noetic, right? And we think of our experience to be lesser than our kind of our logos, our ideas of God. So I was trying to think how to define these terms, how to define them a little bit differently than in the text, and we'll return to the text. The first thing to note, I think, going back to our themes of emphasis and presence, or mediate and immediate, is that logos and noesis are mediate words, and pira and aesthesis are immediate words. And here are my brief definitions. By logos, I think we can understand thoughts. I'll explain why, but logos means thoughts here. Pira means presence, or to be present here. Noesis means intuition or intuitions. And aesthesis means apprehension. So logos means thoughts. Pira means presence. Noesis means intuitions. And aesthesis means apprehension. So let's read this again. For the saints, the sages, the saints, the old men, the old women, the holy ones, say that it is impossible for thoughts of God to coexist with the presence of God, or for intuitions of God to coexist, pardon me, with our apprehension of God, i.e., thoughts aren't, there's no duality, thoughts aren't wrong or to be discarded, but thoughts cease in the presence of God. And it's not that our intuitions, I think that intuition is the highest activity of the mind, you know, our intuitions. It's not that intuitions are lesser or something like that, but when we apprehend that kind of almost beyond ourselves partaking of something, that's a stronger bond. And now here's a little bit more reasoning. Our thoughts, even as logos, are inadequate to compass or to scope the logos. Our own logos, our own thoughts, our own logi in our minds partake of the divine, but they're not adequate to compass or scope the divine, who gathers and embraces and integrates everything, right? And pira as presence. Well, I wondered about this, presence, to be present to. In Greek, it is translated basically as experience or expertise. Expertise comes up first in modern dictionaries. And I thought, experience, expertise, that's very interesting. So familiarity, expertise means familiarity. It means intimacy. It means being at ease with. Familiarity, intimacy, being at ease with, I think are fair renditions of elements of what David and also us mean by presence. I think that's, David, you pull me up on this if I'm wrong, but I think that's fair enough. And then if we translate noesis as, and the noesis is, it's the faculty of the noetic, which is that which may, pardon me, that which may be beheld by the apophatic. The apophatic is the way to the noetic. The noetic is the realm of the highest things we have, our intuitions, right? Aesthesis as apprehension. This is a little bit tougher, maybe. But if we think of a few sessions back when we were talking about experience as impression, that which presses in on us, right? That which presses, and apprehension, it's not comprehension, it's not our taking the measure and being in control. And apprehension is what comes to us, it just comes to us, that's it, right? And I think that Maximus's notion here of aesthesis, that's fair enough, I think. Beyond us, it engulfs us, and it changes us, and it renders us present in a way. Now, and then let's look on the bottom of page 126 when Maximus then defines both experience or pira and aesthesis, which Michael read out earlier. So my accounting of pira was presence or to be present, based on familiarity and intimacy and ease, right? Maximus says experience pira, that knowledge, it's always interesting, knowledge, always knowledge. That knowledge based on active engagement, hence the presence part of it, the being present, which surpasses all reason. We've talked earlier about how presence is larger, it's greater than it encompasses choice. It encompasses error. It's more than that, right? And then following on, by aesthesis, Maximus means that participation in the known object which manifests itself, emphasizes itself, draws itself forth beyond all conceptualization. Michael beautifully explicated this earlier. But beyond all conceptualization, even intuition doesn't really weigh that much anymore. When one is being pressed in on by something holy, when the presence of the other is pressing in on one in a good way. But his juggling of these words takes me back, and this is the last thing I want to say, it takes me back to how we began in a way with the idea of integration. And then also the idea of emphasis and presence. Because I think that proceeding through thoughts or proceeding through intuitions is a way of a mode of emphasis, and proceeding through presence and proceeding through, partaking or apprehension. Present. Those are both modes of being present as well. So this is the passage which caused me. It's one of the most exciting passages, I think, in all of Maximus. He just all of a sudden he just flips everything. Not normal maybe, but how we might assume that things are going to proceed. And I think I would say the dangers that David identified early on in this session, the dangers which weigh most heavily on the virtues, or as a virtue, are those of the mind. I would say that those excellences can more simply weigh more heavily than excellences of the heart. And Maximus here is reminding us, as we've seen throughout the session, that the discernment of how these various elements belong and are integrated together in one, in one person, in one presence, in one essence. Yeah.
Andrew,
David, what do you think? Yeah, go on.
Andrew, do you see, Karl Barth makes quite a distinction between at least that rational knowledge and revelation.
Yeah.
And he draws in Revelation that we are not the actor, but the acted upon. Do you see this experience as a similar understanding, or is that something different? Because it feels to me that what he says that we get to participate, it's not that we're the actor, but we do participate in what God is doing, and that's how we experience, and that's of a different category of knowledge. I think of Michael Polanyi again, of that we know what we love type of thing. But I think that for a lot of people, this distinction between knowledge and revelation moves us from actor to or subject to object.
Is that the distinction, Dave? Isn't revelation also a form of knowledge? Could we choose another term to distinguish between revelation and whatever as forms of knowledge?
Right. Yeah. It certainly is revelation as a form of knowledge. It's that it is God initiated, not our initiated. And I think that what I'm taking from the description of experience is that this is an experience that's given to us. It's not one that we initiate or create or anything else. We participate in something greater than ourselves. We don't create the situation in which we're experiencing. But I'm asking, I'm not.
No, I think you're pointing to something really key here, which is we need to deepen this idea of experience then, or pira, or presence even, maybe, right? I think, and I was smiling because I remembered an anecdote that a Greek priest told me about this word which came to mind when you were on the next page when Maximus is defining the let's say the activities of the Trinity. He uses the word cooperation, which is translated as synergy, which is a term which we will likely be familiar. Synergy, cooperation, synergy, or synergia theologically. And the Greek priest, I remember, it was George Papadimitriou, David. It's a lecture at the monastery. I have a recording of it. And he spoke kind of flippantly about it almost. He said, yeah, no, the sun is shining, God is shining, but I can close the blind. I'm Greek, I can close the blind, right? As in, I don't have to cooperate with God, right? I can close it. And I thought at the time, it was a little bit, but it's a vivid image, and perhaps fair enough. I don't know that the strength of that distinction ought to endure between God-given and human driven, because if it's one or the other and not a mix, then one seems to be acted upon and the other seems to be acting. And at least in Maximus and in the tradition, this idea of synergia, energy together, it's part of what we've been talking about with the cultivation of the attentiveness to be present to another person. That's part of our energy together with, right? It's partly the kind of work of the mind and the heart that Maximus is gesturing to just here. But, and I'm very, very, very nearly reaching the end of what I can and ought to say about this matter theologically. So David, I'm gonna point to you in a minute. But it's not just one way or the other way, right? Experience is not just undergone. We use that term often, but it's not just undergone. That's not what we mean by experience. Otherwise, presence would not be an adequate term for it. It's us there too, and what then occurs between us, through that event. But the weight of it, the emphasis of it, is on our receptivity, I would say.
Yeah. Okay.
But emphasis, again, emphasis, not duality, and not 100% or nothing.
Right.
They're not opposed, and it's just we're talking about weight again, oddly, the topology, the topos of this question. Where does it weigh the most, right? But I think your question is very apropos, Dave. I think it's very important to ask that question now. David, go. What do you make? What do you make of this?
Oh, I think it's. I mean, all of these steps that are laid out here in such a Spartan way.
Yeah.
And that you have done such a beautiful job of. They all are good. But what happens at the end is you are apprehended.
Yeah.
You're apprehended. You're seized. And when we think of the biblical moments of apprehension, of revelation, of the unveiling of the mystery of it, those are apprehensions. People are seized.
But they were there to be seized.
They were there to be seized. I think of Moses behind the mountain, going there in search of his vocation, going there after murdering an Egyptian, going there after seeing the suffering of his people, which he is kind of a part of, and in the Pharaoh's household. He is apprehended in that moment. And his place in it all becomes something new. his cooperation, the synergia, becomes something of a new order. So, yeah, apprehension. What a great word. Huh?
Yeah.
You should appreciate this, David, because you're a lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know about apprehending people.
Yeah. Is this distinction it may be an inadequate example of it, but with Aquinas's amazing rational thought, writing up the Summa, and then the revelation that happens on St. Nicholas Day, that where he says everything he's written is just straw, because he's at that point appears to have experienced something far beyond what rational thought can give. This isn't to renounce anything that Aquinas said, but he just sees it all so inadequate. It seems to be not a bad example of what Maximus is getting at
I
a
think
millennium earlier.
so. I think so. Maybe
Yeah.
without knowing too much.
But there's a bit of a difference in spirit here. Bye, Lorraine.
Bye, Lorraine.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I am here.
Yeah, yeah.
I look forward to seeing everyone in
The
2 weeks. Sorry,
incarnation
guys.
of bodily presence is understood.
Yes. Exactly. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
You.
So Aquinas, because of his systematic thinking, which is his great dialogue with Aristotle, leads him to that moment of saying it is straw. That certainly speaks to the power of the beatific vision,
Yeah.
the power of being apprehended. But it's Maximus, I think, is not, because Maximus is rooted in not a systematic theology
Yeah, that's true.
based on Aristotelian categories brought into conversation with scripture and tradition. He is rooted in a theology of the spiritual life. How do these things unfold for us? So as Andrew has so lovely laid out here, all of these matters, logos, experience, presence, intuition, they all count. They all count.
Yeah.
And they reach their fullness when we are apprehended by a revelation which is unfolding.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that is, David, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And you're noting that Aquinas is responding, answering within, as it were, or answering to the systematic thought of Aristotle, which is the greatest system of thought that we have. I'm assuming that I think that word systematic is what was meant earlier by the idea of a closed ontology, systematic or closed. I think that's a fair enough. I didn't think of that earlier, but I think that's fair enough. A systematic ontology. It goes so far, and it goes that far well, very, very well, like Aristotle or like Aquinas, who's brilliant on everything. But David, your point that's not the ground. Maximus knows that ground, the Aristotle ground, but that's not the ground on which he's standing. And so I think that this is why, if this line of thinking is true, that systematic or closed ontology is then a part of relative knowledge, this is where on 126 Maximus says, yeah, that kind of knowledge can lead us to truly authentic knowledge. It can, right? And it often does. But he says, if we have this other kind of knowledge, it also does often supplant that, right? It leads to, it's not to be, you know, disdained or anything. It's to be treated carefully as everything, but not to be, you know, sloughed off. Yeah.
Mm.
I would like you, Andrew, to just in a paragraph write up the using these Greek terms, what you have said, which lead to the I mean, maybe it's not that these are not that they are steps necessarily on some kind of ladder, but they are well, maybe they're just signposts along a way. And the way is to this this coming to the place where one is addressed, where one is apprehended.
I like that very much, where one is addressed, where one is called by name, where one is included, yeah, of course, and I can do that. But also, David, you point to something very, very important here about the whole nature of what we mean to do when we're thinking, and when we say we're thinking theologically, which is consider what we're actually doing. Steps is risky, and there's the image in our tradition of the ladder of divine ascent, which we might, it's a great icon. We might get to it later. It might come up in another way. Theology is sometimes considered as steps. You know, we go here, and then once we get here, then we go here. It's kind of like virtues, right? And then you get up to here, and the more excellence and stuff. Signpost, the other term you just brought up, David, is it's a more colloquial and yet far more, I think, appropriate term for how we consider theology in our tradition, which is a signpost, is that every now and then it says, hey, don't forget to watch your step. So you keep going. And then a little while later it says, hey, don't forget, be attentive, right? Watch your step. And then you go a little way longer with your companions, right? Along the riverbank, or what have you. And then a while later it says, there's a bridge coming up, i.e. there's something coming up in life, so consider it well. And on like that. That's a kind of folksy way of thinking about theological articulation. But it's not far off. Images are what are the images, David? What are some of the images that come up?
One with respect to signposts that you didn't use there that I get is encouragement. I mean, how long, if we've ever driven or walked a distance, you start questioning, is this the right path? And a signpost provides that as well.
True, but to speak strictly, sorry, I meant to be narrowed down to, say, theological articulation. Right. Encouragement comes in the form of community and liturgy and agape and this kind of thing. So that's part of it too. I'm not trying to characterize the scope of our theology, just the idea of theological articulation. Right? Encouragement, I think, is a natural byproduct of that too, I would think. Yeah. But maybe I'm doing it clumsily. I was just interested in how David for a moment stepped into the consideration of what theology would mean by that word, understand what we're doing by that word. Because I think that Maximus in these passages is also both questioning and emulating what he considers to be. And I think it has to do with a lot of what we talked about tonight, but what David Goy, you brought up to begin with, and then David Jennings, you responded to, and Michael, what you were recently speaking about the implications of the union and what we try to do there. Yeah. Well, it's 7:10. David, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Only we have a few other texts to consider.
Yeah.
We're behind.
That's not a concluding thought.
No.
Yeah, hold on one second. Let me pause the recording.